I welcome you all to the lesson number 20 of the course Linguistics 2, English 504. Now, as you can see, the word written stylistics, a branch of linguistics which deals more with the practical aspects. Now, before we talk about stylistics, what is stylistics and how we use stylistics in language, let's look at what we did in the last class. Pragmatics was the branch which we talked about in detail. Pragmatics is the study of how to do things with words, and we talked about what the words are, how the words are arranged in sentences, and how we use different words to put stress in our speech or put emphasis in our speech. And we also talked about the different speech acts, the acts behind the speech or the functions that we perform using different speech patterns. Now, we discussed about the direct speech acts and the indirect speech acts, the way we use directly the speech acts, the way we use sentences to emphasize on certain things directly, or to convey or to communicate what we need to communicate in direct words. But then we also saw that there were some indirect ways of speech act, like somebody wants to criticize or somebody wants to give an order. He would do or she would do it in different words. He would do it in indirect words, just conveying the words, and won't really go for the direct accusation. Now, speech acts include asking for the glass of water, for example, promising to drink a glass of water, threatening to drink a glass of water, ordering someone to drink a glass of water, and so on. Some of these speech acts, as you can see, are we saw an example of drinking a glass of water, and we saw that one can perform different speech acts, like for example asking for a glass of water, or promising to drink a glass of water, or threatening to drink a glass of water, or ordering somebody to drink a glass of water. We saw that there were three basic types of speech acts, like for example assertion, question, orders, and requests. And we saw a table in which the sentences were given and the purpose for those sentences were given, and the different speech acts that were performed using those sentences. For example, assertion, I assert, or I tell you, I tell you to do something. You are asserting, and you're putting question in direct words sometimes. Do you know did Jenny get an A grade? We saw a very familiar example about the academics, like did Jenny get A grade? Now, this was a direct way to ask about Jenny's grades. And then we saw the indirect ways. Do you know Jenny got an A grade? Or do you know Ali took food? So then we also saw the orders and requests, how we can make orders and how we can convey, or how we can, then we had the imperative sentences to give orders, and then the indirect ways to give orders. Requests also, we saw some indirect ways to put requests and some direct ways to put requests. Even for three basic speech acts, other expressions were possible. This is what I was talking about, like you had indirect ways. The three basic speech acts can be performed using direct sentences and the indirect sentences, like you have expressions other than the interrogative sentences. If you talk about the question, asking a question, you have the other expressions like do you know he got A grade, or you may say did he get A grade? That is the direct way. And do you know he got A grade? Then that is the indirect way. Appropriate reply directed to speech act meaning rather than literal. Now here, if the answer, then we saw how it is answered. For example, the direct way, did Jenny get A grade? The direct answer would be yes, she did. And then looking at the indirect way, do you know Jenny A grade? Then the reply to that is not to the literal meaning, like yes I know. That would sound a bit blunt or inappropriate according to the social situations. So we saw that there were some indirect ways, like yes she did. Now that is exactly the same way you reply to a direct speech act. So here you are basically replying to the speech act, not to the literal sentence, because a literal sentence, the answer to that would be yes I know. So that would sound a bit blunt or a bit direct or inappropriate according to the social situations. So now Then we saw that there were some conventional indirect speech acts like questions, assertions, complaints. Could you close the window? Would you mind closing the window? I would like you to close the window. Then we saw after that, finally we saw some performative verbs like the words I pronounce you as husband and wife. Now this is using the performative verb directly. When you are using it directly to perform that speech act. For example, I hereby declare that you are I hereby declare that you have passed the examination. Or when you say I hereby declared, that would create confusion. That won't be a correct sentence. Though there you are, whenever you see hereby and after hereby you see that the sentence makes sense, then of course it is a performative verb being used. But when you are using it like he pronounced, or he asserted, or he threatened that if somebody did he threatened somebody to do something, then you are not using it as an performative verbs, because you are just reporting a situation. He threatened to kill him. He threatened that if he didn't give him money, he would kill him. So that is basically just reporting the situation. But when you are using it directly with the first person, I threaten you to that if you don't give me the money, I'll kill you. Now this is the use of direct performative verbs. So performative verb, there are performative verbs which are used to directly perform the speech act. Now today we're going to move on to a new branch of linguistics that is basically that deals more with the practical aspect. Now we look at a few definitions of stylistics, because there are so many definitions given by so many people that we need to look at them one by one. And then we also talk about the merits and demerits of these definitions, how they meet the requirements of what is done in stylistics. And then after that we're going to move on to the practical aspect of stylistics. Now, a branch of applied linguistics concerned with the study of style in texts, especially, but not exclusively, in literary works. Now, the first thing that needs your focus is the word applied linguistics. So this means it deals more with the practical aspects, how the linguistics is applied, and it deals with the study of style in texts, how the style is found out in the text, how the style is analyzed, how you look at the style of a certain text, how you analyze a certain text and tell us that what style has been used, or what stylistic devices have been used, or what the literary devices or the poetic devices have been used in that very text. So it is specially but not exclusively for literary works. Especially this branch especially deals with the literary works, but not exclusively. Well, you can use this technique, the technique of analyzing using stylistic techniques for other texts as well. But especially when you evaluate literary work, when you analyze a literary work, what is there in the literary work, and how the literary work has been written, or how the literary work has been produced, or what devices have been used in literary works, then you are talking about the stylistics. So not exclusively, but especially being used to analyze literary texts. According to Katie Wales in A Dictionary of Stylistics, 2nd edition, she says that the goal of most stylistics is not simply to describe the formal features of texts for their own sake. You are not explaining the features of the text just for their own sake, but you are explaining it. Their purpose might be different, and you're looking at the overall impact of the text, and you're also looking at the individual devices used in the text. You need to know about the literary style of the writer. So you talk about so many other things beyond that. You talk about the literary style. You can also talk about the age in which that text was produced. So it's not to describe the features for their own sake. You're explaining the features for different purposes. Now, they also show their functional significance for the interpretation of the text and in order to relate literary effects of linguistic causes where these are felt to be relevant. So you are also talking about the functional significance, how they are used and what is their role, why are they being used for the interpretation of the text. In order to understand a text, you are looking at the devices. Those devices will help you to understand what is the overall impact of the text, or what is the how the text was produced, and what does the writer wants to say, what is the hidden underlying meaning of the text, and what the writer had in his mind or her mind when producing a certain text. Or in order to relate literary effects to linguistic causes, why certain devices have been used, or how the literary effects have been given by what literary effects have been given by a certain writer, where these are felt to be relevant, how they are relevant to the text, and how they are relevant, for example, to the style of the writer. There are various overlapping subdisciplines of stylistics. Now, some of the fields, some of the disciplines, subdisciplines that are related with the field of stylistics could be literary stylistics, interpretive stylistics, evaluative stylistics, corpus stylistics, discourse stylistics, feminist stylistics, computational stylistics, and cognitive stylistics. Now see, stylistics is being used in so many fields, because in stylistics you are basically analyzing the language, you are analyzing the text, you're analyzing what effects text has, why certain language is being used, to what effect certain language creates when it is used in this order. So you can see that almost all the branches have come under the blanket of stylistics, like literary, like interpretive, like evaluative when you're evaluating a text, corpus stylistics, discourse stylistics, feminist stylistics, computational stylistics, and cognitive. So it touches the inner aspect of language generation, and also the outer aspects inside a man and outside in the society. Wherever the texts are produced, wherever the certain language is produced, you can use the field of stylistics in order to evaluate. Now, in the words of Halliday, we see a definition. We can define linguistic stylistics as a description of literary text by methods derived from general linguistics theory. Using categories of the description of language as a whole. You're taking different categories of language, general linguistic theory, you're using different categories of the description of language as a whole. How the language has been described, you're taking small categories in order to evaluate text, in order to analyze literary text. As Halliday says that linguistic stylistics, it's a description of literary text by methods. Which methods derive from general linguistic theory. So you're taking methods from the general linguistic theories, you're taking chunks and you're taking small categories, and then you are applying them on literary text to analyze the text, to see what are the impacts of text and what could be the underlying meaning of the text, how a literary text is producing certain effect, what the poet or writer wants to say in a certain text. So all that can be analyzed using the devices, using the theories, using chunks from the general linguistic theories, using the methods given by the general linguistic theories. A comparison of each text by the same or by different authors is the same, and in the same and in different genres. Now, comparison, you can also compare two texts. To see to analyze one text, you can also compare and to see the style of the writers. Different styles of the different writers are different styles of the same writer, what the writer wants to say in one text and what the writer means in the other text, like by the same or by different authors, in the same and in different genres. So it's a very broad horizon you can judge the style, you can analyze a text, you can analyze one text of the same author, and you can compare it with another text by the same author in one genre. For example, in novel or poetry or drama or any other short story, you can analyze one author in the same genre, you can analyze two authors in the same genre, or you can analyze two authors in different genres. So you can have a variety of analysis. You can analyze it in so many different ways. The field of stylistics is so broad. It's got a broad canvas. You can compare, you can look at one author, you can look at the style of one author, and you can also compare the style of the same author in two different genres, and you can compare the style of the two different authors in one genre or in different genres. So it's a broad canvas. Stylistics more commonly is a scientific style of study. A scientific style of study, or you are studying a style, or in a scientific way, or it's basically you are studying a style in a very scientific way. Is more commonly is the scientific study of style. The term style here has to do with those components of features of a literary composition which give to it individual stamp, marking it as the work of a particular author and producing a certain effect upon readers. So it puts a stamp of a writer. It identifies the style of a writer. When you analyze the text, here you talk about the style, and then you stamp a certain style to a certain author. You come to know about the style of the author, you come to know about the techniques of the author, how the author uses different techniques to create impact in the text or to create a certain effect in the text. So some of the authors, they are identified with that style. They use a lot of poetic devices, they use a lot of other linguistic devices like similes, metaphors. So they are basically using devices to create impact. That is their style, that is the way they do it. So basically you are looking at the device, at the way certain writers, they create impact in the text, literary text. So then you identify certain writers with those texts. Sometimes it's very common that you are people who are well read and people who read some authors more, they become aware of the style of that author. And people, for example, who have read a lot of poetry, and whenever they read that verse, sometimes they identify the verse, they read the verse and they identify that yes, this verse has been written by such and such poet. So they can know about the writer from the text. The text becomes a picture for the writer, for the reader. From that very picture, the reader can identify a writer, because the writer, he can see the style of that writer in those literary texts. Work of particular author and producing certain effect. So basically the effect is on the readers. The readers can identify the writer through the text, through the style. Now, stylistics is not something opposed to literary criticism, for between true literature and linguistics there is no conflict. Now, looking at this statement, we see that a very close link between literary criticism and stylistics, because literature and linguistics, here we see they are not different things. It's not something opposed to literary criticism. It's just like literary criticism. It's almost the same thing. It's not opposite. So because why? What is the reason? Because true literature and linguistics, there is no conflict. They are almost the same thing. The real linguist is at least half a literature, or the real literature is at least half a linguist. Now see, the literature people and linguists, they are the same. They are a real linguist is the one who knows something about literature, and a real literature person is the one who knows something about the linguistics. So because literature and language, you can't really separate them totally, because you are using language in literature, and you are using linguistics device to create effect in the literary works. For a poet writing poetry, if a poet doesn't know the devices, the poet doesn't know the language, doesn't know how to play with the language, how to use different linguistics devices to create impact in his poetic work, then that poetry would not be really considered to the mark. And in the same way, a person who is studying language doesn't know anything about the literature, or doesn't know anything about how to create the musical effect in poetry or in the literary works. So for a linguist, it would be very difficult to study the impact of words. So a linguist, when he's studying the use of words in different sentences, how the words have been changed and how the words have been replaced by other words, then it would be very difficult to analyze, to give the true picture of the role of words or the role of sentences in a text. So a literature person and a linguist, they are almost the same, because they know each other's fields, and a linguist knows how the literature people, they use different words, and why the literature people, they are replacing the words, or why the literature people, they have used some words again and again to create the musical effect. So linguistically, if they don't know anything about literature, linguistically they would be considering it an incorrect speech. Linguistically, they won't be able to analyze it correctly, and linguistically they would be considering it grammatically wrong expressions. But when they know something about the literature, and when they know what the literary people they do, what are the literature, how the literature is being written, and how the poets or the prose writers, they are employing different devices, and why they are repeating a certain word in a certain verse, then only they can analyze it correctly, and they know that yes, the poet has used this word again, repeated the word to create a musical effect. So basically, stylistics is not something opposed to literary criticism. It's almost the same thing, because literature person and the linguist, they are doing almost the same job. One is playing with the words, one is using language to create impact in poetic works, and the other is studying language in order to analyze it correctly, and in order to see the usage of such words, of different words in the literary works. So both of them, they are basically using each other's areas, and they are aware of each other's areas. Now, the real linguist is at least half a literature. What we meant by this expression was that the real literature is at least half a linguist. So they are basically doing each other's job, and they know, they are aware of each other's job. Stylistics is an attempt to make literary criticism much more scientific. It's basically, when you talk about the scientific, you say that the devices are being used for a certain purpose, and the literature, certain literature has used, you see the use of many devices in literature, in certain literary piece, just because of a purpose, just because the writer or the literature or the poet or the prose writer wanted to create a certain impact. So that is why he or she used certain literary devices, certain linguistic devices in his piece of work. So it's basically scientific. He's using it scientifically. Now, there is a certain way to use these linguistic devices in literature, which we'll definitely talk about later, that even there is a science, a proper technical way to employ the words, to use the words at different places, and that is scientific way. So when you talk about making scientific literary criticism much more scientific, you're talking about stylistics. So basically, it's a scientific study of literature, or scientific way to analyze literature. It is an attempt to make literary criticism objective and precise. You're basically making it objective. You are making literary criticism objective. You are not involving yourselves, and when people who are analyzing literary texts, they keep themselves out. There's no subjectivity. They have no personal opinion in talking about the style of the writer. The style of the writer is analyzed through the study of the text. So it's objective and precise. The way you see the devices being used in a certain text, that way determines what is the style of the writer. It stresses the need to perform a literary grammar of language, a literary transformation, and satisfactory definitions of various literary terms such as style, poem, image. So when you are giving definitions, proper definitions of different terms, you're basically you're talking about the grammar of language. It stresses the need to form a literary grammar of language. Literary grammar of language. Now this is a new term here, literary grammar of language. We were so far talking about the grammar of language, so here it is a literary grammar. So how grammar is modified, how different words are used, and you create a new kind of grammar which is applicable to the literature, which is applicable to the literary works, and from that you give a definition of various literary terms. What is style, what is poem? When you talk about the definition of poem, you basically talk about the scientific way. The scientific way a grammar has been created, a new kind of grammar has been created for the purpose of producing literary works. Stylistics is not statistics either. It's a borderline discipline which gives double challenge to the students. So it's not statistics. Now when we talk about the scientific phenomena, we talk about the scientific way again and again. Now this doesn't mean that stylistics is a statistics. There are no statistical analysis. There is no statistical analysis in looking at the style of writers. But yes, it gives a double challenge to the students. Now what is this double challenge? The challenge is of linguistics and literary criticism, besides the knowledge of other factors. Now the students of stylistics, they have to look at linguistics, the use of language, and also how it has been used, how language has been used in a certain literary work. So it's a double challenge. They're also looking at the use of language, and they're also looking at the style of the writer to create impact in the literary works. Besides the knowledge of other factors, they also have to look at psychic, social, historical knowledge. What were the historical traditions? What were the historical norms when this certain literary piece was created. So they are looking at so many other things as well. What was the psychology of the writer, and what were the social norms at that moment, at that era, at that period of time. So what were the social norms, what were the historical traditions, what were the historical historical impact on the writers. Because when you study the literary works of a certain period, you also see that there is an impact of these socio-political conditions, socio-economic conditions on the writers, and their literary works, they portray the situation at that period of time. So basically students of stylistics are looking at so many things. They're also looking at how the language is being used. They're also looking at the impact of that very text which is in front of them. They are also looking at the psychology of the writer. They're also looking at the social norms at that very time, or they're also looking at the historical way the language was being used, and what was the impact of the economic or socio-economic conditions at that period of time. So the students of stylistics, they are faced with double challenge here. They are involved in the study of literature, which is primarily a language act of the community. So it's such a beautiful term we've come across, the language act of community. The people, they were performing some language acts, they were using language to create literary works. The novels, the plays, the short stories, the poetic works, all those, they were created in different eras, in different periods of history, and what were the writers doing? They were basically using language for that. And what was the style of the language at that time? What was the shape of the language at that time? How the language is being used to create such literary works? All that comes in the domain of the study of stylistics. How what the students of stylistics are facing what challenges, different challenges the students of stylistics are facing. It requires the combination of artistic gifts and scholarly qualities. It is the result of talent, experience, and faith. So, study of stylistics basically, it requires what? A combination of artistic gifts. The students of stylistics must have those artistic tastes, must have those talents which can help them to study literary texts and to analyze a literary text, keeping in mind so many factors. It is a result of talent, experience, and faith. They must have a faith in themselves. They must be experienced to see different literary works created in different periods of time, and they should be talented enough to take out the grammar, the literary grammar being used in those literary works. Stylistics, traditionally known as a study of literary texts using formal linguistic tools, can also be done via sophisticated computer-based applications. Talking about the modern age, now you can also look at literary works using computer-based applications. You have such softwares which can help you to see what devices the poet or a writer is using in a certain literary work. So it's study of literary text using formal linguistic tools. So you have those formal linguistic tools in those softwares, and those softwares can help you to identify the number of times a certain poet has used a certain word. So counting that, you can also analyze it and you can know about the style of that writer. So this is now in the very advanced field, and you're now using computer-based applications in order to analyze the text, in order to analyze the literary text, and in order to see the styles of the writers. Some stylisticians quantitatively analyze. Some stylisticians quantitatively analyze large amounts of data and text, not possible otherwise, and thus can provide answers to questions such as, for example, what is Dickens' writing style in his novels? So what they're doing, they can have the quantitative analysis also by taking a large amount of data, and they look at how Dickens uses certain techniques in his novels, and then they can talk about Dickens' style of writing. So what are they doing? They are analyzing literary texts, a field of social sciences there, and they are applying the quantitative analysis through that field. Now this is really marvelous that some stylisticians quantitatively analyze large amounts of data. How Dickens has used certain techniques, how Dickens has used devices, how many times Dickens has used a certain word in his novels. So that can determine about what is Dickens' style basically. Now this is a quote coming from Soumya Sharma, Language-Wise in Times of India. So from here we get a clue that you can analyze literary texts using quantitative analysis. The preferred object of study in stylistics is literature. So it's easy to study literature through stylistics. So how we can see you use stylistics, the preferred object of study. What do we study to see stylistics being used? What devices, or how the devices have been used in different literary works? The preferred way is to study literature, not any other text. Literature is the preferred way, because the linguistic devices are so extensively used in literary works, so it becomes easy to analyze the text. Whether that can be institutionally sanctioned literature as high art or more popular non-canonical forms of writing. So he says that instead of studying the other non-literary forms or studying the technical writings, it's better to study the literary works, because that will in fact aid us in studying the use of writing devices and the use of linguistic devices in literature. So the preferred object of study is in stylistics is literature. The traditional connection between stylistics and literature brings with it two important caveats, though. The first is that creativity and innovation in language use should not be seen as the exclusive preserve of literary writing. What is the meaning of this? Of the words here? The traditional connection between stylistics and literature. What is the traditional connection? That gives us something. The connection, the link between stylistics and literature, it gives us two important facts. The first is that creativity and innovation in language use should not be seen as the exclusive preserve of literary writing. So it's not only in literary writing that creativity and innovation is visible. It's not only the literary writing, it's not only the storehouse, the exclusive storehouse of literary writing. Only literary writings, they don't show creativity and innovation. There is a traditional connection between stylistics and literature. That the first thing it brings out the first fact is that only literary writings, they don't show us the creativity and innovation. Many forms of discourse, advertising, journalism, popular music, even casual conversation often display a high degree of stylistic dexterity. See, it's the other kind of speech as well. It's the other kind of writing as well. For example, advertising, journalism, popular music, and even casual conversation among people, casual conversation between two people, that also has style. There you can find style in all these fields, not only the literary writings. So it's not the creativity, right, and the creativity and variety. The use of style is not only related to the literary writings, but you can find it in so many other different fields: advertising, journalism, popular music, and even in casual conversation, casual communication, you can find style. It's even casual conversation, they often display a high degree of stylistic dexterity, such that it would be wrong to view dexterity in language use as exclusive to canonical literature. Only the literature, the biblical literature, or the literature that is related with religion, or the true literature. So you cannot relate style only with the true literature. It's not the property only of the true literature, but you can find style in all kinds of writings. The second caveat is that techniques of stylistic analysis are as much about deriving insights about linguistic structure and function as they are about understanding literary texts. Paul Simpson says, the techniques of stylistic analysis, how you analyze certain literary works using the techniques of stylistics, they are in as much about deriving insights about linguistic structure. How you are applying them, what you are doing, you are not only studying the use of linguistic devices, you are not only studying the linguistic structure and function, but you are also trying to understand the literary text. So we see a very close link here again between the literature and language, that while studying any literary works, while studying the techniques of statistical analysis, stylistic analysis, while studying the techniques of stylistical analysis to any literary work, we see that it's performing two roles. You are not only studying the techniques, you are not only studying the use of language in those literary texts, but you are also trying to understand the literary text as well from the aspect of literature. So you are basically dealing with two things here. You are dealing with language and literature both. Rhetoric, close reading, and stylistics. What is this? The difference between these three types of techniques. these three types of readings. Stylistics is in a sense the modern version of the ancient discipline known as rhetoric. Well, in the ancient era, rhetoric was a field which taught people how to write, the style of writing basically. Rhetoric means to write effectively, the effective way of writing, writing style. Now in the modern version we call it stylistics. So stylistics basically talks about the use of language in order to create literature, the use of language in order to create literary works. So in the ancient era they used to call it rhetoric. Rhetoric was the art to write good English or good language, which taught its student how to structure an argument, how to make effective use of figures of speech, and generally how to pattern and vary a speech or a piece of writing so as to produce the maximum impact. See how effectively you can use language, how language can be, how you can play with linguistic devices, how you can use them to create a certain work, create a literary work. That was being taught in the shape of rhetoric in the ancient era, and now it is stylistics, which taught about students. Now you can see some of the focus words here in red. How to structure an argument, how to make effective use of figures of speech, and generally how to pattern and vary a speech, how to create a pattern of speech, how to change the pattern of speech, how to replace the words, how to change the places of words in order to create impact, maximum impact of the text. So that in the ancient era called rhetoric, and now we call it stylistics. Stylistic analysis attempts to provide commentary which is objective and scientific. See, a commentary which is objective. You are just talking about the objectivity here, no subjective analysis. Whatever is given in the text, whatever is the style of the writer, or whatever way the writer is using different devices to create impact, that is given. It's not subjective report, it's an objective, it's no subjective style, it's the objective style, or it's given as it is, and scientific based on concrete quantifiable data and applied in a systematic way. The specific differences between conventional close reading and stylistics. Now see, let us see the difference between the specific differences between conventional close reading and the stylistics. Close reading emphasizes differences between literary language and that of the general speech community. Stylistics, by contrast, emphasizes connections between literary language and everyday language. Now see the distinction here, that differences between literary language and that of the general speech community. That is close reading. What is close reading? The difference between a literary language and the general speech community. And what is stylistics doing? It basically emphasizes connection, the link between literary language and everyday language. So the general speech community and the literary language, that is the difference. That is the close reading can identify those differences. The close reading, you can identify, you can see the differences between general speech community and the proper literary language of the writers. Whereas stylistics, by contrast, that emphasizes connections. That is the differences, and now we have the word connections. So close reading talks about the differences between the two kinds of writings, whereas stylistics talks about the connections or the links or similarities between literary language and everyday language. So stylistics uses specialized technical terms and concepts which derive from the science of linguistics, terms like transitivity or under-lexicalisation. So you have collocation and cohesion. You have some specialized terms which you can find in stylistics. And these scientific terms are coming from the science of linguistics, and they are being used. The terms you are employing to talk about the stylistics. So here we see the difference between the proper stylistics, close reading, and what is the difference between these two, and how you can identify the differences and the links between these two stylistics and close reading. Now, stylistics makes greater claims to scientific objectivity than does close reading, stressing that its methods and procedures can be learned and applied by all. Now, this is a claim made by stylistics that it talks about more scientific objectivity than does the close reading. Close reading doesn't really talk about the objectivity, and it stresses, stylistics stresses that its methods and procedures can be learned and applied by all. It's for everybody. It's for even for all kinds of people who are analyzing language or who are applying the techniques of stylistics, because there is a lot of objectivity. Anybody can apply these techniques. Aims of stylistic analysis. Stylistic analysis, unlike more traditional forms of practical criticism, is not interested primarily in coming up with new and startling interpretations of text as it examines. Doesn't talk really about the new, shocking, startling interpretations of text, because traditional forms of practical criticism, traditionally they are really giving us new things, or they are giving us very surprising things. But stylistic analysis, it claims that it's not giving, that it doesn't primarily comes up with new and startling interpretations of text. It gives us the general use of language, the general use of linguistic devices. Rather, its main aim is to explicate how our understanding of a text is achieved. Basically, stylistics wants the reader to understand the text. It is more interested in making the readers understand what is in the text. It examines in detail the linguistic organization of the text and how a reader needs to interact with the linguistic organization to make sense of it. Basically, it talks more about the interaction of the reader with the text. How the text is easy, how the text becomes easy for a reader. It doesn't really give us a very high techniques, or doesn't really talk about the new or startling facts. It basically talks about the interaction of the reader with the text. Now, we see the news comes, we see a quote here, the news comes from knowing explicitly something that you had only understood intuitively, from understanding in detail how the author has constructed the text so that it works on us in the way that it does. Look at the last few words, they're so important here, that it works on us in the way that it does. So it's basically more interested in the interaction of reader with the text. It wants the reader to understand the text. It doesn't really talk only objectively about the devices of the text. Doesn't give us the startling facts of about the use of literary devices or linguistic devices in the text. It is more interested in the interaction between the reader and the text. Now, often such detailed examination of text does reveal new aspects of interpretation or help us to see more clearly how a text achieves what it does. But the main purpose of stylistics is to show how interpretation is achieved. See, as we talk about interpretation, so what is the main purpose? The main purpose is basically how interpretation is achieved, how the reader can really interpret a text, and hence to provide support for a particular view of the work under discussion. It's basically giving us support. It's basically talking how a reader can really interpret a text. It doesn't talk only about the devices used in the text, but it's more interested in having an interaction. It talks about the interaction level of the reader with the text. Now, technically speaking, we see the stylistics is a study of linguistic features of literary text, phonological, at all levels. Though we have different levels here. Phonological, lexical, syntactical, which directly affect the meaning of the utterance. Now, Enquist in his essay on defining style in linguistics and style mentions 6 different approaches to style. Now, let's look at these 6 different approaches. They treat style, number 1, as embellishment. Embellishment means ornamentation, decoration. Embellishment, a shell surrounding a pre-existing core of thought and expression. A shell, a beautiful shell, an attractive shell, a decorated shell surrounding the expression. encapsulating the expression, the thought of the poet that is inside a shell, a beautiful shell of language. Number two, as a choice between alternate expression and as a set of individual characteristics. Now, as a choice of alternate expressions and then as a set of individual characteristics. So alternate expressions, we're going to look at these concepts later, what they mean and how the poets or the literary writers, they are using these techniques in order to create impact in their texts. Number four, as a deviation from a norm. What is stylistics? It's a deviation from the norm, the existing norms, and when a writer deviates from them, you can say that a writer is employing different techniques. Number five, as a set of collective characteristics. Now we're going to look at these techniques later in detail, but number six, as a set of relations among linguistic entities that are stable in terms of wider spans of text than a sentence. Now, looking at the merits and demerits of these definitions, basically so many different definitions. I told you in the earlier part of the lecture that there are so many different definitions of stylistics, and from them we have picked up these 6 different concepts, the important definitions which really give us a very clear idea about stylistics. Now, there are certainly merits and demerits. Of course, the concepts and ideas in literature and linguistics, they have always been subject to criticism. So there has been a criticism against these concepts or definitions. Now, let's look at some of the positive things and some of the negative things of these concepts. Now we're going to just introduce the merits and demerits in this lecture, and we'll proceed by talking about the further talking about the further merits and demerits of the other concepts in the coming lecture. Now, style as an embellishment. Some definitions mislead us about style. When you talk about the embellishment, the decoration, the beautiful part of a language, you are sometimes misled. How? The definition which regards style as an embellishment or addition to central core of thought or expression mislead one to think that plain English has no style. Now here we think that when we talk about that literary works have a style, or writings have a style, have a decoration, we think maybe that the general writing has no style. In addition to central core, look at the words, in addition to central core of thought and expression, mislead one to think that plain English has no style, and that some utterances have style while others don't. Well, that is naturally one is misled by this fact and may see that may think that some of the writings, they have style and some writings they don't, because when we restrict to just stylistics as a decoration, we are misled. We see that maybe we think that maybe some of the writings, they have that decoration, they have style, and while the others, they don't have. So the criteria goes wrong here. When we see that they separate the outer hell of style from the inner core of thought, this is what this definition means, that they basically separate. This idea separates the outer hell of style. The style is separate from the inner core of thought. What is core? The thought of the writer, the actual thought of the writer. And when you apply the shell around it, then looking at from this aspect, we think that the shell is separating. Shell is absolutely a different thing than the thought, and you are separating the thought from the core. They thus postulate the existence of pre-linguistic thought or pre-stylistic expression. And what they do, they in fact, the writer's original thought cannot be separated. Now, in fact, what is the fact? The fact is that you cannot separate a writer's thought from the style. You cannot separate the writer's thought from the language. A writer conveys a certain thought in a certain language. A writer uses certain techniques to convey a certain thought. So may change the technique to convey the thought of, for example, melancholy, the thoughts of sadness, the thoughts of joy. All these are basically, they have different kinds of expressions. The writer uses different techniques or the different ways to express different feelings and thoughts. So how can you separate the thought from the style? In fact, the writer's original thought cannot be separated from the way it is said. It is difficult to distinguish between utterances that have a style and that which don't have style. So very difficult to separate, because every thought, every expression would have a style, would have a way of expression. Essentially speaking, no sentence is without style. Every sentence spoken has some style. The language has been arranged in a certain way. The words have been arranged in a certain way. The sentences have been arranged in a certain way to create the impact, to convey that thought. So you can't really separate the thought from the style. Every sentence spoken has a certain style. Now, looking at the second concept now, style is choice between alternate expressions. Another definition which says that style, what is style? Basically, it's a choice between alternate expressions. You change the expressions and you change the style. No writer can use all the resources of his language at the same time. Of course, the attempt to define style as choice is trivial. It's not really dominant thought. It's not really very impressive thought here. Difficult to determine why a writer chooses one expression and not the other. It's very difficult to see how the writer replaces words and how the writer doesn't use a particular expression for a certain thought and doesn't use another expression for another thought. So it's very difficult because the choice is very difficult to consider. The ordering of language involves grammatical, non-stylistic and stylistic consideration. A writer may have grammatical consideration, may have a non-stylistic consideration, and may have a stylistic consideration in order to arrange the language. A writer may have different ways, different techniques to order language depending on the thought of the writer. Now we have a beautiful example here. In X loves the child, we can only use a human subject in place of X and say maybe the father loves the child, and we cannot say to eat loves the child. So there's only one particular word or a human word, a word which denotes a human being, that can be put instead of X. We can't put just anything in place of X, like to eat loves a child. That would be a meaningless sentence. Now this involves basically the grammatical choice. Here we have a grammatical choice. You can't put some other words here because the grammar would go wrong or the meaning would go wrong. No. Proceeding, we see in the second sentence, to eat is not permitted by the laws of English language. The laws of English language will not allow us to put the word to eat. Now another type of choice may be the choice between mother and father. Now we have another option here. Both the sentences, one, the father loves the child, and two, if we replace the father with the mother loves the child, are grammatically possible. Well, but the speaker would choose only one depending on the situation. Such a choice is non-stylistics. So he would choose according to the situation, whatever the speaker means, whether the speaker wants to talk about the love of the father or the love of the mother. He would choose only one. But there is no chance of using a word which doesn't denote a human being, like to eat. We just saw the example. To eat loves a child. That would be a meaningless sentence. Another type of selection could be the choice between fine woman and nice lady, or between my father and my old man. Now these choices are basically stylistics. Both are grammatically possible, even idiomatic, but both have a certain range of frames and reference in common. So here you are basically using the stylistic choice. This type of choice may be labeled stylistics, because you can say my father and then somebody says my old man. Now this is basically using a different word just to create style, just to create a particular style. You are just using word my old man. You basically mean my father, but you're using old man just for a style. Or nice lady, fine woman mean the same, but you're just creating style, or you are changing style or changing words in order to create style. So stylistic choice exists not only in lexes but also in phonetic features like special voice quality, speech, rate, etc. Phonemes, singing, singin, morphemes, sings, singeth, words, phrases, clauses, sentences and larger units. All these they can denote stylistic choices, stylistic words, stylistic stylistic device. Like you see, the special voice quality, somebody might vary voice to create a style. Like you see mimicking. In mimicry, somebody changes voice in order to create style. Speech, rate, number of words, the speed, the slow, speaking slowly, speaking fast, speaking loudly, speaking in low tone, phonemes, singing, changing the phonemes, changing the sounds, and changing the morphemes, the words, singeth, words, phrases, clauses, sentences, larger units. In all these you can make stylistic choices. You can use different words meaning the same just to create style. So hence the definitions which treat style as a choice to or indicate various types of choices must be distinguished. It must, in order to define it clearly, we must differentiate between the various kinds of choices, because it's not just a matter of making a choice, because sometimes if you just make a choice, the sentence would go wrong, as we saw in the case of to eat loves a child. So the choice has to be clarified, the choice has to be distinguished. What choice? The linguistic choice, the stylistic choice, just the grammatical choice. So it's not a matter of only making choice. A branch of applied linguistics concerned with study of style. Summing up today's talk. A branch of applied linguistics concerned with the study of style in text especially, but not exclusively in literary works. Linguistic stylists, the description of literary text by methods derived from general linguistic theory using categories of the description of language as a whole. The two definitions we saw in the start, that talks about the description of literary text by methods coming from the general linguistic theories. Then we saw the comparison of each text by the same or by different authors in the same or in the different genres. We saw what is the broad canvas of stylistics, that you can study the style and you can also compare the styles of different authors of the same author in different genres, or by the different authors in the same genre or in different genres. Technical speaking, stylistics is the study of linguistic features of a literary text for a logical, lexical, syntactic. At each level you can study language. Style as an embellishment, just ornamentation. Then we talked about the two different definitions, two different concepts about stylistics. That the first concept was about embellishment, that basically stylistics is just talking about the outer core or the outer beautiful shell around the thought. That is the decoration of language, the decorative aspect, and that the concept says that it separates the thought, whereas we saw that this is wrong, because we can't really separate the thought from the expression. We can't separate the language from the thought, because every writer has a certain style, uses a certain style in order to convey a certain thought. Styles, they may vary with the thoughts. So you have a writer may have a different thought and may use a different style to express that thought. Style is a choice between alternate expressions. The last thing we saw was that it's just not just a matter of changing the words, making a choice between words, because sometimes you change words and the sentence goes wrong, a meaningless sentence, you get a meaningless sentence. So the choice has to be identified. What kind of choice is to be made, whether linguistic choice, whether stylistic choice is to be made, or grammatical choice is to be made. So it's not just a matter of making a choice, the choices have to be identified. Now, this is what we had about stylistics, the first part of stylistics, where we saw some definitions and we looked at the roles of linguistics and roles of linguistics in stylistics, and the role of stylistics in analyzing text. And we also came up with two different definitions, two different concepts. We're going to move to the other concepts in the coming lecture. Now, till then, it's Khuda Hafiz from here, and this was the end of this part of stylistics.